All right, welcome everyone to this final keynote session for the workshop. We're delighted to be joined today by Professor Markus Kroger. He's the Professor of Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki. He is a prolific author covering many of the themes that we've talked about during this workshop, so we're delighted to have him to kind of close the workshop with his remarks. His work blends theoretical, conceptual, and empirical analyses of resource extraction and its impacts on nature, on geopolitics, and on affected communities. He's the author of many books, including Contentious Agency and Natural Resource Politics from 2013, Iron Will, Global Extractivism and Mining Resistance in Brazil and India, and he has a forthcoming book called Clear Cut, Political Economies of Deforestation, forthcoming with Cambridge University Press in 2025. So today, Markus will address the topic of extractivisms, resistance, and judicial politics. Thanks again, Markus, for coming. We're delighted to have you. Your work's really informed how we conceptualized this entire program. And I'll hand over to you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's two kind words. So I will share some notes based on the limited experience I have from South America, especially Brazil, and then India, and some Arctic cases. But I will start with focusing on first a particular case of corporate land title fraud and how that is used to grab lands in Brazil. So this is the first part of the presentation, and after that I will talk more generally about natural resource politics and especially the role of resistance strategies, local groups' role mostly in Brazil and India, looking at iron ore conflicts and also pulp investments, tree plantation expansion, so different sectors, forestry and mining. And I will relate this to the general overview of what's happening now since 2005 in global extractivist expansion in several sectors, new conflicts, discuss a little bit about the methodological issues when studying these kind of things, especially from the point of view of political science and kind of interdisciplinary studies, case studies, multi-sided political ethnography, how to do systematic analysis across many cases, tens of cases and so on. And then discuss what resistance strategies have worked and what outcomes they have had in terms of economy and politics. And then lastly, I will end by addressing more in directly this theme of the conference here, the judicial politics. So let's start. So this is extreme south of Bahia in the eastern parts of Brazil, and that's where I started to do first research on these kind of topics, on forestry extractivism. There was a huge partly Finnish investment, Finnish-Swedish investment by Stora Enso, a paper pulp company. It was the biggest foreign investment of Finland at the time in 2004. And they invested in the Mega Pulp investment model, a joint venture with a Brazilian company. And you can see in this area, all those marked areas with the green and yellow, where at the time, in 2004, 2005, the areas that the company owned and controlled and had monoculture eucalyptus plantations planted on. And this is the region where the Portuguese first landed in 1500 in Porto Seguro. And you have a very rich rural mosaic here. You have Afro-Brazilian Quilombola communities, you have indigenous groups of different tribes, Pataxó, Tupinambá, and so on. And then you have a host of peasant communities who have become landless because of this expansion of these corporate enclaves of tree plantations for the pulp mill, for the production of paper. And the company has its own export code and so on. In 2004, April, the local landless movement did occupation of this eucalyptus plantation and cut down 25 hectares. And at the time I was living in Rio de Janeiro, so I traveled there to cover it and do research on that topic. And then after that, I continued to study this topic of pulp investments in the whole of Brazil and wrote a PhD on that. So here you see the pulp coming out of the factory. And most of these pulp mill machineries around the world, they come from Finland, so the technology has direct linkages there. Over 70% of the pulp produced flows through these machineries produced there. So we have a clear stake and role and responsibility to study these issues. So here you see how it is. You don't really have undergrowth. These are cloned, sometimes GM eucalyptus plantations with a lot of use of agrotoxics, pesticides, herbicides. And they grow only for a few years, 2 to 7 years maximum, and then they are cut and replanted. And this has also been premised on deforestation of the existing Atlantic rainforest in the region, so it's still ongoing. Like in these photos, you can see there used to be very rich rural mosaic there of these rainforests, and the big part of my visits there since 2004, I have visited several times and followed it now for over 20 years, is the kind of like hearing from the locals what's happening and so on, and they tell of the violences and kind of not respecting the rights, especially the land rights. So, and this particular area, for example, is part of a farm that is owned by by a farmer that has a 700-hectare farm. I will talk about him later, Pereira. And the company has just grabbed his lands. It's not a small-scale farmer, so you have like also bigger ones. So here's another map. There are like in this purple you can see the Veracel lands, but then on the south you have also other Susano and other company lands. So it's a big impact on the region. And then the other areas are like you have a lot of cattle ranches and so on, so you don't really, the sides of the roads look like this. So you have landless camps there, people without a home, former like peasants might have been working as rural laborers or have had a small farm, and by pistol or other violent means, coercion, they have been driven out of the lands, or then they have sold the land, or they have been working in a big farm and now they have to go to the shanty towns of the towns, and which are very violent in that part of Brazil because of that investment grabbing land. So you have different movements, you have tens of different types of landless movements working there. So an interesting thing that surfaced at one part of these talks, also in Finland, and media coverage of these issues, was that the company claimed that they have 100% legal documents for all the lands they own, which of course researchers know is not the truth. And then I engaged with colleagues in Brazil into a research project to study with the archives of the state. You have to go to the state capital in Salvador to study the archives, like to see from different archives if that's true, if they have the land right documents. And so we did archival research, analyzed the legal documents, also field research in sites and interviews and other materials. And we were interested in seeing that how these land laws in Brazil seem to provide like tenure security and rule. And we found many inconsistencies and irregularities. So, for example, these are like different types of corporate land grabbing methods using the courts. So the one discrepancy we found, that for example there's that they are using a land title which is actually in another municipality. So say you say that you have a land in Unapolis municipality, but actually it's in Morto Seguro. And then there's a discrepant claim size, like you say you have a 100-hectare farm in reality in the title, but then you say it's 900 hectares, so extending the borders. And then there's no valid chain of ownership or the invented title numbers and so on. So these shouldn't exist by the Brazilian land laws. So here's one example of for example, this Fazenda Santa Maria. So here has the matricular number and the municipality and the size claimed by the company, 950 hectares. And this is to kind of like put attention to the claims made by companies, that you really have to go to the sites and study what they say. You cannot take it at a face value what they say. So for example, all these titles, they are in a different municipality, Una, not in Porto Seguro, so that's like one like a discrepancy. And then another one, they say it's 192 hectares in total, but actually, they say it's 950, but it's not so much, it's 992. And of these títulos, 7 do not even exist. No, 2 of the 7 do not exist. And then there's the authority in Brazil, in Salvador, called CDA, which should, like the state author, that should like recognize these titles. Anyway, this is just an example that kind of research that is ongoing. And then I mentioned this case of the Pereira brothers, so they have like a big farm, 700 hectares, over 10 workers, and they have bulldozed the farm several times, although they have the landholding documents. So it's like they can continue doing that, and they can like have the courts then give like eviction decisions to these people, although they don't have the land right documents to show. So and then some courts have ordered the company to do like kind of technical investigation on the borders of the area, but the company has not done it. But still, the company is able to use some local judges to get like the police to come and dispossess them. And it was interesting, like in 2018, Finnish journalists came there from the Finnish broadcasting company and did this media story with them. And then right a few months after that, the local judges put these people who were in the documentary to jail. And they have been to several years now in the jail, and they even put their lawyer into the jail. And then when I went back there, 2022, they said that you know that there was some corrupt prosecutor or something, and they just like invented charges and put them to jail as a punishment for speaking to outside media. And there's practically no local media that would be critical. The only local media person that was critical is also charged, and he has escaped and lives underground, not to be jailed also. And this is like a Finnish company we are talking about with the biggest shareholder in the Finnish state, Stora Enso. So here is a photo of the factory destroying their house, the tractor. So it seems that in Brazil the land laws are mostly accessible for the large corporations for their tenure security. But and then, as I said, there were many irregularities, and the company can still get these orders. But what's interesting here is that still the locals very much rely on justice and the law and litigation. They hire lawyers, they use an enormous amount of time in these legal claims, and you know, I'm kind of like perplexed by that. But then some explain that that's the only opportunity they have, and other ways are even like more blocked. So, but anyway, that was the first part of the presentation, just a showcase. And if you have any ideas on where to bring it is and whatever, you know, I have not really studied these legal issues so much, but I mean, this is kind of where direction I seem to be going because of like trying to uncover the truth and what is going on and so on. So then to some other issues that I have studied more in detail beforehand, it's like these resistance strategies and which seem to work, which don't work. So this extractivism boom is related to the phenomenal rise of commodity prices and profits. So here you see, for example, the price of iron ore. You see it's a stable market until about 2005. Then the rise of China led into a spot market because there was so much demand for iron ore by Chinese steel producers that they just started to buy instead of the fixed contracts. And then this led to a huge rise in the price of iron ore. And in many places around the world, this then led to a rapid investment cycle with not so big care for the impacts. And especially you saw this in India, like there were like over half of the Indian iron ore mining after 2005, by 2010, 12 was like illegal, so they went beyond the lease boundaries and so on. And there was a lot of resistance against that. And this is related more closely to the general trend where since 1900 in the world, the relative value of commodities against like capital goods has decreased in global trade. But we can see here like that since around 2005, the price has increased dramatically and it has continued to rise. Like gold is in peak prices. During the COVID, the commodities like timber, cattle and so on were really, really high valued. And I think we are in a new paradigm shift. The time of cheap resources is over because of climatic ecological crisis. We have many barriers to cheap extraction of minerals, so-called resource nationalisms in places like Indonesia and so on. And then also like climatic barriers like we see in the Arctic. Permafrost is melting, collapsing, and that infrastructure needs to be repaired. for extraction to continue or advance, you have new perils and also resistance from the locals, especially to water and other contamination issues. So it's not anymore the kind of world where you would say that if you don't invest here, we will go to another place. No, the world is limited, and you can see that in many cases. The companies might say that, or states might say that to get the project through, but that's not really the case. You have to look at the sectors more in detail to see what would be the actual alternatives and what are just invented and so on. So here are two books about those results I will be talking about in the next slide. So this Iron Will book is more like an ethnographic take on the same research project, and then the other book is more like explaining how I did it, and also at the same time opening up the qualitative comparative analysis as a method and looking more in detail at the role of some contingencies and contextual issues and kind of testing more in detail the arguments made. So maybe about extractivism, there's been many definitions of extractivism, and this is kind of like a loose definition. I will soon talk more in detail what I mean by that. So it refers to resource extraction that leaves barren, toxic or void spaces, destroying the prior places and lived environments, causes extreme inequalities, and is non-developmental. So this is kind of like an extreme form of resource extraction. Not all resource extraction should be called extractivist, like in that negative connotation. There is also resource extraction that is limitedly extractivist or partially that is or is not extractivist. In this photo you can see actually from eastern Goa, northeastern Goa, and here you see the mountaintop that has been stripped away from its vegetation in Western Ghats, and here you see this blue canvas that is a canvas that the mining company started to put up so that the activists wouldn't see from the satellites the illegal encroaching of the mine outside of the leased areas. So the activists were using the satellite photos to make dossiers to distribute them to the judges and litigation and so on to show that actually this is beyond lease areas. So you have these struggles ongoing in many things that you can observe in the field, like so on. So I think it's more useful analytically to say that there are many characteristics and degrees of extractivism instead of saying this is or this is not extractivism. And as I said, there are many types of extractivisms in different sectors: forestry, mining, hydrocarbons, even beyond that, like so-called green energy projects, wind, solar, whatever. So there are different practices. Like one category is that it can erase most or all forms of the preceding life forms. Like, for example, an open pit mine, you don't really have anything there. The mining companies call that the overburden that is on top of the soil. So that also is reflective of their kind of worldview. And then the second category is expand monocultural monotonous life forms, like that's the case of, for example, soybean plantations expanding over the Amazon rainforest. So you have this variety of web of life of existences there that is then replaced by soybean, sometimes corn and then cotton and some humans there, but then because of the use of pesticides, then all the other species are not allowed really to exist there. So it's also, I think it's useful to think about extractivism from that perspective of criticizing this aspect of modernity. And then the third is like producing barren, toxic or waste environments, mining tailspawns, use of pesticides in the soil, erosion, drying, and so on. And then the social impact, economic impact, creating steep inequalities, like for example in Brazil or elsewhere, when these corporate-owned plantations expand, they do not really produce much jobs, only for a few. And currently, for example, there's a tendency that the precarious jobs of like using a tractor to spread the pesticides that used to provide some labor opportunities are also replaced by drones. So that means higher usage of doses of pesticides and so on. And then the owners of those plantations can own, like if you are like a middle-sized soybean farmer with 5,000 hectare farm, you earn like every month 20,000 euro profit. So that's a lot in Brazil. So and then I think that it's useful to recognize that there are different degrees, like I said. And there can be also non-extractivist stances, for example, some indigenous communities that are not actively resisting extractivism, but they are not extractivist. And then anti-extractivist, like social movements that are radically against corporations and so on, and different degrees of that. So I think it's useful to separate that. So you can create like tables like this. So you, for example, you can put the category into different types of activities like Amazon Cerrado, Brazil soy plantations, illegal gold mining, and so on, if they are hyper-extractivist or partially and whatever. Yeah, so for example, as an example of anti-extractivist practice, I have put here the agroecological settlements of the landless workers movement in Brazil, and so on. So I mean, they can be limitedly extractivist, but they are anti-extractivist in the social sphere, and also in terms of like they actually restoring the land. So the ecological restoration is ongoing to the agroecology. And I have put here also an example of Finland, so I think these frameworks can be applied beyond the global south. Then something more in detail about India. So India has in Goa and Bellary, Kudremukh in western India, Goa and Karnataka, the mines were closed in 2012, and that's like after that, like half of the Indian iron ore mines were closed, and that's really phenomenal globally. And that those decisions came by different routes. In the case of Goa and Bellary, the Supreme Court decided to ban, for example, in Goa, iron ore mining, and after the Supreme Court decision, then the mining actually stopped, which is interesting, and they were stopped and didn't continue. And that's quite phenomenal, because you have cases, for example, in Norway, where the Supreme Court has said that the windmill has been built illegally on Sami lands, but it's still there. So, you know, the rule of law kind of like can be applied better in some global south context than in the global north. So I have found that when studying these contexts and resistance, often you don't hear about these. There's a lot to learn also in the global north on these issues. So this iron ore here, it caused a lot of tuberculosis and pollution and whatever. And the locals resisted in many ways. Mostly it was based on non-violent resistance, which had different characteristics like the Skandian Satyagraha, but then also Ambedkarian kind of Dalit non-violent resistance, and then Adivasi movements, which also took the form of kind of armed resistance or threatening to use arms in some cases. So there were civil war contexts in Chhattisgarh, in some other parts of India. So I wanted to understand these different forms or variety of resistance strategies. How does it work in different contexts? And of course, this has a link that like the many activists were saying that as long as the mineral is in the ground, they are winning, because then you are not destroying it and you are not doing it. So this is Vales iron ore mine in Carajás in Brazil. It's one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest, in the eastern Amazon. So my field research entailed going into these mining sites like here, talking to the local people, and then like here in India, in Bellary, you can see it's like an irreversible change to agriculture, from agriculture to mining regions. So there are some concepts that we use, for example, path dependency, like after that, when the region is moved into from agriculture, the topsoil has been taken out into mining, then locals don't have other option than to work or somehow try to get a little bit of the mine or to get a living by that. So it's a kind of like technological lock-in, kind of a deep political power that you can have when changing the physical landscape in that way. So these are big struggles, in a way, these extractivist struggles. They affect like the society in many ways. So then some methodological notes. So I think it's important to recognize that there should be sectorial studies and subsectorial studies. Like there's many studies, I would say most studies, that don't really differentiate between the sector when you are studying resistance. Like, for example, mining it's a different thing than industrial forestry. And even in mining, you have open pit underground, which have quite completely different dynamics, because it doesn't produce so much impacts, typically the underground as the open pit. And then what is the scale, what are the actors, which minerals are you talking about, and what methods of extraction you have. So these are kind of control variables that you should control for if you want to really understand what is the role of resistance, because it can be an easier target, more difficult target, whatever. And then like forestry, like is it a corporate, small or a state, what kind of tree plantation and so on. And then you should control also the role of political system and other contextual issues. So Brazil and India were both, at the time when I studied them, between 2005 2015, kind of like consolidating democracies, large democracies, federal systems, so they could be compared. But there was still like interesting differences between them, which allows to make some notes, because if they are too similar, you cannot really make in a comparative study any notes on the context, contextual role. That said, I wouldn't directly generalize the findings that I present here, for example, to authoritarian contexts, like China or Russia, or then into Western democracies, which I haven't studied so much in detail. But I think still that it would be interesting to do some studies based on these hypotheses that I present on those contexts and see how you should change the apparatus and the kind of set of strategies that seem to work. And then also you should consider the role of targets and type of conflict. So if it's armed conflict, non-armed conflict, that changes dramatically the issue. Like when you have a civil war, then you know, even the role of peaceful movements becomes pretty difficult. Like if you want to protest peacefully, then both sides, the paramilitaries or the army, and then you know, the revolutionaries or secessionary movements can say that, you know, if you don't use arms, you are up against us. So you are pitted in the middle. So it can be really difficult to be doing this non-violent resistance in those contexts. And then role of the targets, you can have like national capital companies, or you have multinational companies, you can have private state companies. So I also took that into consideration and studied what's the difference there. And those can open different possibilities. Like there was this Korean POSCO steel mill company in Odisha, eastern India, and the resistance was finally successful against them. They couldn't implant the steel mill there. And they partly used that argument that it's a foreign company, because there were also Indian companies wanting to get there. So they can use this leverage of, you know, finding some other companies that, or actors that would actually be extractivist, but would also be in favor of barring that particular investment project. So that's kind of like third party role and then government and so on. And then state actors. State is a very complex entity and so on. Yes. So these are the sites that I studied in India and Brazil. So you have here Goa, Bellary, Kudremukh, and then in Tamil Nadu, 2 cases that were blocked before they started projects. So we had here both like so-called greenfield and brownfield projects, like projects that were like not started yet, and mines that were already running but were still discontinued or and so on. And then you have this bunch in Odisha and so on. And the civil war contexts are here in southern Chhattisgarh, Basta region, and then here in Western Singhud. And then in Brazil you have a bunch here in Minas Gerais, where you have the big mining tails dam collapses in Mariana, and then in other places in Minas Gerais, and then you have the Vale iron ore mining here in Pará. But I also studied these pulp investments, like I said, so this is like comparison also between the different sectors. So this here are the pulp mill investments from 2006 that I compared in Brazil for the same kind of strategies. So here is a set of 6 key strategies of resistance that I came up with after reading social movement studies, different literature in Latin America, in India, and especially by talks with the social movements, key activists and so on, traveling to different places and comparing, refining and so on, using the qualitative comparative analysis framework. So first is like what I call social movement organizing and politicizing, actually a social movement organization, like for example the Landers movement in Brazil, MST has 1.5 million members, and it's like it has a structure, so it's an organization. It's not a global social movement in the sense that, for example, the feminist movement or global environmental justice movement that are not like structured in that sense that they would be united. And then campaigning, which means like heterodox or non-modernist, in some cases like campaigning, like saying you cannot eat eucalyptus. And then protesting, which is like visible, physical, disruptive, innovative, protesting by mass scale that is noted by media, so there's some impact there, like land occupations, roadblocks, sit-ins, different kind of issue things, versions of that. And then networking with different, creating networks locally, nationally, transnationally, similar entities, other entities. And this can take like a deep form also, that you spread this model of using these 6 strategies to other entities. So you network by that way. You share the best practices. And then the 5th is retaining autonomy of the movements while co-producing or embedding the state. So there's been a long debate in Latin America in the 1980s, early 90s, because of the dictatorships there. The civil society really wanted to be autonomous. They didn't want to have anything to do with the states, so anarchist tendencies. But then slowly they have started to participate in the co-production of the state. And by that co-production, I mean that you kind of like create interpersonal ties, you try to create new institutions, you participate in different kind of politics there, and to shape the power relations and so on. But it's tricky if you lose the autonomy. So especially important here is to retain the autonomy. So this concept comes from Peter Evans, who had this concept of embedded autonomy, by which he was studying the kind of ideal form by which states should have industrial policy with the industrial sectors or economic sectors. So he said that based on like this Weberian ideal state structure, the state bureaucrats should have autonomy, but they should still embed particular sectors, like he studied in Eastern Asia, the IT sector, and how then they will like using different forms of midwifery and so on to create these new sectors and help them to be created. But then I kind of flipped it to study how civil society can also use that strategy in relation with the state. And then the 6th one is avoiding private contracts with corporations, so kind of private politics deals, stakeholder dialogues, accepting compensation if they can start the extraction and so on. So I studied that as a strategy, and when it was active and when not. So here is a more detailed list of them: mass social movement, non-modernist framing, and So let's go first to this movement organizing. So for example, the landless movement, they are organized in several ways. They have like always a male and female or non-binary coordinator for each sector, and they have over 20 different sectors for different areas like health, education and so on. So they are self-organized in that way, and they have that in different levels, like local level, national level, state level and so on. So it creates like a grid of organizing. So here you see one case from Bahia. You have these ranching areas here, which then the landless movement wants to have for creating a landless settlement with like 10-hectare plots for each family in a communally owned like federal state land reform grant setting. And they are living like for years, like 8 years by the roadsides, producing some herbs and selling them in the markets and surviving and pressuring to get those lands, which the pulp companies also want for eucalyptus plantations of this size. And for example, here it says that here will be born the new MLT movements settlement. So they have won the struggle there, and they are able to cut down the trees. And often they use the argument that this is not, their land. Like a big part of these lands were illegally taken in the past, and then by the Brazilian constitution, if the land is not socially productive, then it can be expropriated for land reform, or should be. So that's the mandate, so they can make use of that. And then campaigning, so for example here they say affirmative reform already, and Aracruz should leave. And here is a case from Tamil Nadu, this photo from Salem, that's a holy hill, and the people living around it came to know that there was a plan to mine this hill in the downtown of the city. And then the locals went and mobilized there was a textile industry, important textile industry around the city, around that hill, and it was a sacred hill. And quickly they managed to mass a group of like 3,000-4,000 people who then marched to the local government offices and demanded to see the permits given to the mining company quickly. And they said they wouldn't leave before getting the permits. And then they stayed there and they managed to get those permits, which showed that the permits had been given in just 1 day, which is impossible. And in many of these Indian conflicts, actually, like the chief ministers of the state were involved as kind of like mafia. So they went to jail, like in Karnataka, it was called like the Bellary Mafia. And they went to jail, these chief ministers, because of those frauds. So then protesting, so here is, for example, one movement is MLT, they are sowing cassava that they have grown and blocking the eucalyptus trucks. So these are very common sites. They are like happening all the time in Brazil and especially in these public areas. So disruptive, innovative, pioneering, meaning that once a kind of one type of protest strategy was used, typically when it was used the second time, the media was not anymore so interested. So they tried to innovate all the time and create something new, more disruptive and so on. So here you see the protests against the Vale company in the Amazon. There's a big railroad exporting the iron ore to Japan, to the Brazilian coast and then to Japan, and the indigenous people and the landless movements were protesting against that and so on. So this was something that I found that both in the mining and pulp investment cases, if they didn't use this protesting, they were not so successful. So this seemed to be like a key strategy. And here's another case from 2008, from the Women's Day, 8th of March. The Via Campesino women's sector was protesting against Stora Enso, who had bought illegally 50,000 hectares of land in the border area with Uruguay. In Brazil, there's a law that if you're a foreign company, you cannot buy from the 150 kilometer border area without the permission of the army. And still they have bought, but they have used what in Brazil is called laranjas, that is like a kind of like a front man. So there are two Brazilian directors, both the land in their name, but the company didn't own it. And they were resisting it, saying this is illegal and so on. And then moments after this photo was taken, then the company ordered the military police to attack them, and they jailed a lot of the women, and they were shot with like rubber pellets and so on, and many of them went to jail for long times and so on. So in this case also, like even though the company is acting illegally, it can manage to get through the help of the governor, who they have funded in electoral financing, to support and keep the decision, like governors in Brazil give the orders for the military police to attack, and they are the most brutal normally. So you have that aspect there. But then you have also networking. But to say that this was still a successful case because the company was never able to build the pulp mill there and had to leave, which is Stora Enso, so it went to Uruguay. And so, although there's a price. So then networking, you have here in the photo indigenous people, you have the Afro-Brazilian Quilombola communities, and you have the landless movement people, and they are like in this network against the green desert that they call the eucalyptus plantations, because they cause a lot of dryness and in the soil and water level and so on. So you here have one map of the landless movement network with many different movements, which is really important also. And then of course this embedding the state by retaining autonomy. So you have had like important cases of class action suits and so on, prosecutors, public prosecutors winning all the cases. But in Brazil, typically, although you have had these huge decisions, like they have demanded the company often, like for example, to replant 50,000 hectares into Atlantic rainforest, they can always appeal, and it can take 20-25 years and then nothing happens. So although you have dramatic decisions by judges, they always find some kind of way to see that there is not really a big like justice happening. Like in Latin America, there's a common saying that for French, everything, for enemies, the law. Which means that, like in that case, the French can, whatever they can do, but then if you don't have French, then you are like treated by the law. You have to bear the brunt of it. And then this avoiding private politics, so if they made deals with the companies, then they were not so successful. So here is one qualitative comparative analysis, kind of like truth table. So you use Boolean logic. 1 means that it was active, and 0 that means that it was not active. And here I have put like multivariate, like number of protests. And here you can see that if they use the 5 strategies simultaneously, the first 5, then they manage to somehow affect the outcome of plantation expansion. So reverse, slowed, discontinued, and so on. But if they did not use all of the 5, they were continued. And especially this protesting seemed to be the key factor here. So these are 13 power holding cases between 2004 and 2008. And after finishing this study, I wanted to study if it applies also more generally. So I started this comparison of Brazil and India and the IMO sector to have like a leeway in looking not only at the pulp sector, but also another sector and then another context. So if I can generalize kind of that kind of processual understanding of different mechanisms. So India, of course, has a radically different history than Brazil. It was formed by Gandhi and other democratic movements. Unlike Brazil, it has never really had like that kind of like mobilization. And in the 1980s, there was also a plan to expand these eucalyptus plantations in India, like happened in Brazil and many other settings. But the resistance managed to block that. So it was never expanding in the same way in India like here in Brazil. So the key lessons in there is that even in very difficult circumstances, resistance can have an effect in stopping extractivisms. And if you use the 5 key strategies or 6 strategies, then you manage to discontinue the extractive operations in India, but in Brazil the results were mixed in the mining sector. So it's a bit more difficult political context than in India. I will come to that soon. It has to do a lot with the Supreme Court also. And then you shouldn't really use private politics. So here is a framework for the study of investment politics. So we are coming now to the last part of the presentation here, the judicial politics. So this draws from McAdam, Taro, and Tilly's kind of like dynamics of contention approach, where you look at the state, corporations, and civil society as kind of like actors that are acting together. So in global environmental governance, you have kind of like 2 takes on the state. Like one is like you look at the state as an actor on its own, and another one is like where the state is an arena, where you like kind of different entities meet. So the state does not have like a strict separation from the society. So here you can see it more like as an arena here. So you have, for example, these different politics here, where this corporate agency or extractivist agency is acting, and then you have on the other hand here different types of resistance actors. Peaceful resistance, you have armed revolutionary agency, armed secession, like in northeastern Indian states like Manipur and so on, which also engage in resource extraction, like coal boom in northeastern India and the area between Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, Burma. But they are not really, the indigenous people, Adivasi people there, they are not really against extractivism as such in many cases, but they use it more to fund their own like armed secession struggles. So you have different forms of like natural resource kind of like relations that locals have. And then you have the armed revolutionary agency like Maoist Naxalite movements in India. They're mostly composed of Adivasi people, and half of them are women, of the fighters, that would like to have this kind of like some sort of revolution and control large areas of India. About 1/8 of the land area of India has been calculated to not be in the hands of the states or outside of state monopoly of violence. So here in the middle you have the state, and then the resistance and the companies can meet in these different political games like contentious politics. So for example, these protests. So you have mass mobilization of people, but then on the other hand, then you have the police or paramilitary or the army coming to meet them. This can be violent also. Then you have electoral politics. So companies can fund the campaigns of particular politicians. But then on the other hand, like resistance can embed these electoral politics by saying that we will only vote candidates that are against mining, and you have to sign an MOU with us if you want to come to do some electoral work in our municipality. So this was used in India, for example. So you can kind of like try to change the rules of the political game by that kind of embedding that you do. And so on. And you can say that all our members, like 1.5 million members, will vote for that candidate if you give us that. So you can use that kind of leverage from the social movement side. And then you have institutional and structural politics. You can try to create new institutions. For example, in India, the social movements, national and Western Indian based especially, and NGOs, they demanded that a new institution is created to uncover these illegalities in the iron ore mining. So they created this MP Shah commission, which was like a national commission that went through all of India to investigate with state resources, hired state investigators, those illegalities. And that was really impactful then. So you can try to create new institutions and mold how they are working. And then judicial politics, litigation, but also other issues here, like how courts work, access to Supreme Court, other courts, and so on. Creating like specific NGOs that are like experts in how to use particular forms of law and so on, and then helping the judges and so on. And then you have here politics that is outside of the state, that is private politics, which would mean those negotiations directly between corporations and the civil society. And then the armed revolution politics. And as a result of all of these politics, then you have the economic policy and political outcomes, investment based and style determined, and so on. So, some words about this judicial politics. So they could strengthen the litigation in court against the project, among other possible outcomes. And for example, in professional NGO, legal NGO, from Goa and Karnataka, you have, in both cases, you have those. They created new capacities for courts to uphold India's mining laws, and also ensured that this took place through their high-quality litigation. So you happen to have those NGOs there, but they are not, of course, everywhere. You don't have such NGOs always, everywhere. In Brazil, the activists have attained better results when embedding and using institutional structural politics. So it's like, those are like different options. Like you can have like, in some cases they use more electoral politics, in some cases judicial politics. I mean, they're like different options. So there's a big variety depending on the case, what are used. So in India, the outcomes have been more favorable to the resistance when it has focused more on judicial politics. But that's an interesting contextual difference. Also institutional politics, like I mentioned, that in the SAR Commission, but it's very related to then the executive branch and the electoral politics, and can shift quickly. So in a sense, like if you can work through the judicial politics, it can be more lasting. And like I said, in Brazil, the Supreme Court is not so effective as in India. A lot of results coming from there. So there was an NGO called SPS, for example, active in Bellary, India, and they reflected to me that the movement's success would not have gone very far without their engagement with judicial politics. Without Supreme Court intervention, the mafia would not have been stopped. So it's extremely important to understand that in the last case, in often the final word for actually discontinuing comes from the court. But that does not necessarily mean that the court would have made that decision without active civil society pressure. Like in Brazil, always when there's a court case ongoing about something, then there's landless movements or other social movement, indigenous movements, they protest in front of the courts. And that the people have said that in this context of consolidating democracy, that's really important to have that pressure from civil society and outside, and it affects how the judges make the decision. So you have to use the contentious politics at the same time with this, so it kind of affects the judicial politics, it's expected. So for litigation to succeed, and this is what the people say, that NGOs would have quite a deep history and embedded relations with the state, as I found out. So it should have been part of the judicial politics, in which the formal and informal rules and power relations have been constituted. So for example, in India's Green Tribunal, which is a national court established in 2010 that specializes in expeditive decisions in environmental cases. So there are many pro bono lawyers or kind of activist lawyers there that are helping the locals, and you can directly access it. So you can overpass the middle courts and go directly to the Supreme Court. In these cases, like in Goa. And then for litigation to succeed, you should have already participated in state constitution by creating new interpersonal relations with power holders and by participating in the crafting of new state structures. So this is not something that you should jump onto, like in all cases. But in some cases it can be really useful. And then I have talked about consolidating democracy. So this resistance, it's also like, it is the consolidating democracy. You know, when you have this resistance to extractivism, it is like the democracy when they are saying we don't want this locally. It's local people saying this is their viewpoint, so they are the democracy, and that is being consolidated in those actions. So generally mining conflicts around the world, resistance had not had legal organizations in their networks. This is what we know from prior research. But when their networks include these players, resistance has been more successful. And this you could see also in Brazil, like when you had mining conflicts closer to cities, you had the middle class professionals joining often into the movements, and that was more successful than in the peripheries. In Goa, key activist NGO had a longer experience built on mining legislation than many courts. It's typically like expertise. So they said to me that they actually knew better the mining laws, and the new judges just appointed there, and then they created like this very detailed dossiers with maps and everything, which made the work of the judges very easy. So they could kind of define and guide the whole process when you have this expertise. So in these cases, like this creates a setting that could be considered a deliberative rule of law, where the civil society feels in from the default state. You have very weak states in many of these global south settings, and also in global north in several settings. So it's a crucial role that can be played here, and also shows kind of like the direct state as arena, that you have the contentious agency having an impact there. And if you don't have that, then you have clearly like the corporate influence more strongly there, defining how it is used. So it's used. Mostly it's lopsided to the other side, to the left side, that I said, the corporate agency. So the judicial politics embedding resulted in a new set of social ties that broke the state-society boundary, as the activists helped state actors to do their jobs better, while increasing the autonomy of the state from capture by extractivist interests. So, although it might seem that, you know, when you are doing embedding, it doesn't mean capture. It's a different thing. Embedding, you are respecting the autonomy and actually giving them capacities to all the entities to maintain that. And more likely to work in settings of consolidating democracy and access to federal and local courts. So, this I don't know if litigation or this judicial politics would work so well in some other contexts, like so on. So that should be empirically analyzed. I wouldn't dare say anything about that. So then some limitations and dangers of litigation. So one thing that was expressed was that it can delegitimize political movements if there comes a negative decision, like they say that you are wrong, no, the mining gets permits or the project can go forward. It's difficult to create mobilization or a political movement after that. So they said only as the last instance, sometimes, like if you have a strong movement and you are not quite sure, you should embark in litigation. So if a conflict is ended too fast by a court decision, there's impressive political outcomes as not waiting for the other strategies to produce results. So if you have these 5 strategies ongoing, you are building a social movement, you are politicizing, you are campaigning, protesting, networking, and embedding in the institutional electoral politics, and then comes a negative court decision, it can be destructive. So I found that if it runs longer and you have a deeper process of talks and meetings and networking locally and broadly, then it has more impressive political impacts also, so that it spreads nationally and transnationally. So for example, in the case of Vale, this mining company, they created like the transnational movement against Vale. all around the world, the Valley is affected. Like there were Canadian people there, Brazilian, there were people from all around the world involved in that. And that's kind of like still deepening because there has not been so big results in terms of like discontinuing the big mining in the Amazon. So it kind of continues this mobilization. So, but this litigation also needs resources, and these are not typically available in key resource frontiers like the Amazon or Brazil, or then it is Chhattisgarh region in India. And these peripheries which typically have people who have been marginalized, indigenous communities and so on, ethnic minorities. So then typically you have the middle classes. If you have those in the frontier areas, then they are like often involved in the extraction business in itself. And also you have these, like in Minas Gerais, you have interestingly like several cases. Other cases in Minas Gerais in Brazil were successful, but then there was one case by Minas Rio, in Conceição do Mato Dentro, by Anglo-American, where the resistance was not successful. And there it was mostly based on Afro-Brazilian Quilombola communities' resistance. The local middle classes were more like white and a different religion, so there was that kind of like stance there, which made it really difficult, and there was much more violence. In other cases, it was more like urban, class-based things, so those things mattered as well. And you had even like, in Minas Gerais, you have a lot of engineers, mining engineers, that they also joined the resistance movements. They joined also like the city mayors joined it, and so on. So you had big movements like in Mariana, where that mining tails damage happened, the collapse of the dam and the kind of flood of tsunami of mud that killed many people. And that you have now litigation in the UK even for that, of Vale and the Samarco company. So in that case you had like before that happened, there was actually, what I cover in the book, there was successful resistance by the locals with the mayor, church, engineers, civil society and so on. They managed to stop the expansion of the Mina del Rey mine. But even in spite of that, that old dam broke there. So there are many cases that, like these cases that I showed in the map, they were nowhere to be found. You had to travel there and actually create that map, so I had to do that map myself. There's practically no media news, or very sparsely, so you have to go from one place to another, learn from other people, and use a lot of time field researching this, like several months and so on. So, yeah. So in here, like in Minas Gerais, because you were so strong in the institutional electoral politics, you didn't really need to use the other forms, like contentious or judicial politics. So it's kind of like you can attain it by different means. So here is a more detailed explanation of the different strategies that I studied, and then the outcomes. So I studied different outcomes and economic and political. But just to showcase here is that E3 means the embedding of judicial politics that helps the resistance in litigation in court against the project by retaining autonomy. And then I'm especially interested in when all mines were or projects were discontinued. So this is, it's just ending here. So this is this kind of table where you can compare, because there's over 20 cases, so it's impossible to study this without a tool like validated comparative analysis. So here you can see 1 is active and 0 is not active, so you have spread of these, you have like serious cases. And you have cases where all mines or projects were discontinued, so here. So this is the outcome, so I'm controlling for the dependent variable and looking at these different causal factors. And you have a mix here as well. Sometimes litigation or this judicial politics was used and sometimes not. And then looking more in detail, I turned this table such that I'm putting here all the cases where judicial politics was used, and then comparing that with the other strategies that were used. So here you can see the 4 other strategies. You can see a quite consistent usage of the other strategies. So you can infer from this that if the judicial politics is used, then typically the movement is quite strong. Otherwise, they don't really embark on that unless they are quite strong in protesting, in organizing, in campaigning and networking. Just to get some understanding of the general dynamics. And then, interestingly, electoral politics was hardly used if they used judicial politics. So these seem to be kind of like alternative rules. Either you use the judicial politics, or then you use electoral politics, or then you don't use it at all. And then here you see the private politics engagement F, and only in 2 cases it was used. So that's also like you use courts and then you don't engage in those stakeholder dialogues, of course, then you're more. And then this is the G1, means like armed conflict or armed resistance actually, like use of arms, only 2 cases. And then G2 means like the threatening that if you don't obey, we will turn into armed resistance. And here actually I have lumped together, like here are 2 cases, Belavin and Abola, and here are 2 cases, so this is like, the method is lumping them together. And here you can see the results. So there was mostly success when judicial politics was used. So you have only this Dantevada case, which was the context of armed conflict. Then Corumba, where there was a very delimited near the Bolivia border, a small ethnic indigenous community that made a deal with the company. And then you have the Caracas old mine that I saw the photo, which is the world's like most important iron ore deposit. So you kind of can explain why there was not a success in these. So based on this data, like it shows that if you embed the judicial politics, you can have important success. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic.